I'm Lisa Senecal.
And I'm Maya May, and tonight we're speaking about how civil wars start and how to stop them with Barbara F. Walter, who literally wrote the book.
Well, if you're following the January 6th committee hearings and you're feeling, reassured that the guardrails of democracy held despite Trump's best efforts, then you're completely missing the part where authoritarian GOP politicians and election officials in Republican-controlled swing states have spent the past 18 months taking those guardrails down and amping up the calls for political violence.
Yeah, a lot of political violence, a lot of violent rhetoric, and that's why we are incredibly thrilled to have the best-selling author of How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, most importantly, with us tonight. Barbara F. Walter is the Rohr Professor of International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Thank you for being here. But should we be? Should we be here? Should we be packing in?
Time to get out of Dodge.
Well, no, we should not be packing. First of all, we are not on the precipice of civil war, although we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. We're going to talk about where we are. But if the people who are aware of the cancer that's growing in our society, if the people who are in positions of leadership and power, who have a stage, a media stage, leave, then we're ceding control to the people who are doing these underhand things to try to gain and then keep power. So no, it's absolutely contingent on us to stay and fight. The civil rights movement wouldn't have succeeded if Martin Luther King and all of those brave people who stood by him instead left, which they could have done. And so I feel like we're in our own fight for the next phase of our democracy, and we're the ones who need to be leading the charge.
I absolutely love that. Though I think, would MLK, would he be on a beach right now chilling with a margarita? But let's talk about the escalation. It's serious business. I joke because this is so heavy. We were just talking about that before this, right? It's so incredibly heavy right now. We're seeing the escalation. Calls for the execution of members of the January 6th committee, threats to people who are testifying. What are your thoughts on some of these escalating moments?
Well, there's another thing that really shocked me, and is also something that if you study civil wars outside the United States, you also see this. I don't know if you had a chance to see Eric Greitens' video, his political ad that he put on, I think it was on Facebook. It got taken down yesterday, I think. He's the former governor of Missouri. He was a governor, and he is in his newest political ad, he was holding a gun and he was calling for that. I think he said, "Today we are going rhino hunting." Right. And I mean, it's really just extraordinary that you would have a politician saying that, calling for violence as part of his political ad to be elected. But even more so, he's calling for the execution of members of his own party. Rhino stands for Republican in name only. And so that would be the Liz Cheneys of the world. That would be the Adam Kinzingers of the world. We know they're getting death threats. And what struck me about that is if you look at other civil wars historically, the first people who are killed are not members of the other side. It's the moderates within the extremists' own party. So think back to Rwanda. The very first people who the Interahamwe was this group of Hutu extremists who were just recently thrown out of power. They're the ones who organized the genocide. The world thinks that it was the Tutsis who were killed by the Hutus, and they were, but the very first people who were slaughtered were the moderate Hutu politicians who had made a deal with the Tutsis to form a new reformed government, and they were the ones who were executed before they then turned on the Tutsis. So here you have an ex-Missouri governor calling for the execution of Republican moderates. It's what we've seen historically as well.
All right, that purity, the cleansing of the party and the movement.
Yes.
Before we get into the January 6 hearings any further, can you describe for us what you believe civil war in the US would look like if it happened and we're not on the precipice, but what do you see it looking like, and what would be the two sides? Because I've heard you say it's not Democrats and Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
So the civil war that we would have here is what I call a 21st century type of civil war, and we've been seeing it around the world. It's not going to look like the old time civil war. It's not going to look like anything from the 1860s. You know, people have this vision of two large armies, men in uniform, dragging cannons, meeting each other on a battlefield, where you know the rebels are actually engaging the U.S. military. That is not going to happen. And the 21st century type of civil wars are insurgencies. They're fought using unconventional tactics, guerrilla warfare, domestic terror aimed at civilians. The last thing they want to do is engage the U.S. military, because the U.S. military is so unbelievably powerful. They understand that if they start shooting soldiers, they're going to be defeated. And so what they do is they operate in the shadows. They make sure that they are very decentralized. They engage in kind of cell warfare where you have different militias all over the country, and sometimes they're coordinating their activities, but sometimes they're not. And they actually have a name for this type of strategy. It's called leaderless resistance. The Bible that they use that outlines how they're going to fight this war is found in the Turner Diaries.
Mm-hmm.
Used to be able to buy it on Amazon. Amazon finally, thankfully, took it off Amazon. But it outlines how you defeat a really powerful federal government with a really powerful military like the United States, and you do it basically by you know, fighting from rural areas, remaining small, moving into cities, planting bombs, assassinating opposition leaders and judges, and then sort of, you know, dispersing and hiding amongst the population. So that's the type of war that we would see here.
And we're not.
And so you say that, because I feel like we're seeing a lot of that already. We're seeing that, you know, are these people who are acting the you know, lone wolves that are acting in places like Buffalo, or Kyle Rittenhouse answering a call to be an armed citizen to defend property? Is this some of the things that we would see more of?
Well,
so I'm going to
ignore the racial element here, right?
Oh yeah. So I didn't answer your second question, which is who's gonna fight this, and maybe we could table that for now. I'm going to state right up front: we should never use the term lone wolf again. If people think about Timothy McVeigh in the late 1990s, people think he was a lone wolf. If you label someone a lone wolf, it makes it seem as if they were unconnected to a larger movement. It makes it seem like this was just an idiosyncratic event. It's an isolated event. We don't have to worry about it. Timothy McVeigh had pages of the Turner Diaries in the backseat of his pickup truck when he bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City in the late 1990s. He was probably part of the largest Michigan militia, which was also involved in the kidnapping, or the attempted kidnapping, of Governor Whitmer. I think that the media, and actually both political parties, have had a tendency to call these domestic terror attacks lone wolf attacks, because it allows them to ignore the larger problem. And for both parties have for a very, very long time refused to admit that we have a problem, because politically it hasn't been expedient. The Republican Party absolutely does not want to say we have a domestic extremism problem because the rise of the biggest rise in domestic extremism here in the United States has been in the far right. It has been among white voters, and they increasingly represent the base of the Republican Party. So nobody in the Republican Party wants to admit that we have a problem. And the Democrats don't want to admit that we have a problem because it's such a racially charged issue. And then the Republican Party attacks them for being anti-American. And so calling these attacks, the Buffalo attack he was a lone wolf acting alone. No, he was radicalized online using the same material that white supremacists are disseminating and reading and acting on. This is part of a larger white power movement that's been growing in the United States at least since 2008 and probably longer.
Yeah.
Deep breath. deep breath.
Yeah, because I it's frustrating that we are willing to acknowledge these things overseas, because there is a real pattern to these marches toward civil war. And when we see this stuff happen in other countries, we do not try to label those terrorist attacks as lone wolf operations.
No.
But in our country, we don't want to see it. And we were talking about this with you briefly before the show. Part of that is, for citizens, this stuff is just really, really hard to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's going on in our country, and it's been going on a long time, and it's exhausting and it's frightening.
Well, and I think, Americans, and, I'm an American, I put myself in this camp. We like to think of ourselves as exceptional, as special, as different. And in some ways we are. We were the first democracy, modern democracy. We created this grand experiment of democracy on a major scale. We would be the first country large country to be able to maintain real democracy in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious way. We are an immigrant country. So there's many ways that we are special, but in more ways we are not special. And one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did, which is I didn't really talk about the United States until chapter 6. Right. I talked about everything that we know about civil wars over the last 80 years in countries outside the United States. And I just told those stories. Here's what happened in Northern Ireland. Here's what happened in Syria. Here's what happened in India. And at a very sort of personal level, and as you're reading it, it becomes clear, oh my gosh, it's so similar to the underlying conditions that we're seeing emerge here. And it just makes you realize that we are human beings like everybody else on this planet, and human beings have a tendency to want power, and if human beings are unconstrained, there will be extreme elements within their population who are going to try to grab power by whatever means possible. So we aren't exceptional, and I actually think it's dangerous for us to think that we're exceptional and special and better than other people, because then we aren't self-critical. And if you believe that terrible things can't happen here, then you don't take any of the measures necessary to prevent it. But the irony is, of course, we had one of the most brutal civil wars in history here in this country. We've already experienced this. Why is it inconceivable that this couldn't happen again in a different guise?
And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I feel like in ways because we feel like we're special, we're like that kid in class who becomes the problem child because we don't want to examine. And when you talk about our democracy, it became abundantly clear in your book that I was like, oh, wow, the sons of soil that you mentioned, like sons of the soil. And I thought about it and I was like, okay, Black people have only recently gotten rights. Like, in a sense, our democracy is much younger than we think it is. And so is that part of the problem, that now there are people who are fully participating in ways that we weren't prior to this? And this is what is kind of making the people who rightfully, like, they feel like they rightfully own America. Is that why they're so upset?
Yeah. So political scientists who study civil war, we know who tends to start civil wars. We know if you were going to go into a country and you were to say, okay, who are likely to be the troublemakers, or who's likely to try to organize violence, we know which groups to look for. And the interesting thing, it's not who people generally think it's going to be. People think, oh, it's going to be the poorest people, or it's going to be the people who are most discriminated against because they have, they're really unhappy and they have reasons to rebel, or they think it's going to be the immigrants. It's not those people. It's never those people, because they tend to be too weak, and they tend to have no resources to organize. And the government tends to be, keeping an eye out on them and repressing them if they do try to act up. The people who tend to start civil wars are the groups who had once been dominant politically and socially and are in decline. It's it's those who are losing power and are deeply resentful of this loss of power and status, and still have power, and they still have the capacity to organize, and the government gives them a pass because they are part of the power structure. And so if you were, for example, to look at, the Philippines is a great case. Southern Philippines has been revolting against the North for over 30 years. Muslims used to be a majority in the Southern Philippines. In fact, they used to rule themselves. This was their essentially country. And then they became part of the Philippines. The Philippine government started moving Catholics down south, to the point where Muslims became a minority group, and they watched this influx of immigrants and of settlers getting the best jobs, getting their land. They saw that in Mindanao, they started practicing their own religion, and so their culture started. They felt that their culture was getting squeezed, and they finally said, okay, we are not going to accept this anymore. The only means that we can hold on to our country is to organize resistance. And you see this time and time again. So the once powerful generally do not go down without a fight.
So here's where I get hung up on this with the people in our country who are already the insurgency or forming the insurgency. These white men, they haven't lost power. They still, this is the imagined great replacement, and they're already acting on their fear. So even, let's imagine that the DOJ prosecutes Trump, his inner circle, we have great accountability. How does that change with these militias and the Proud Boys and the 3%ers? How does that change their behavior? Because it hasn't changed the demographic shift that's happening.
Yeah. So it really doesn't matter what reality is. It matters what their perception of reality is. And their perception is that they have absolutely lost status. And I would agree with that. Listen, if you were a white man in the 1960s or the 1950s, right? You got easy loans. You got well-paying jobs easily. There was very, very little competition for that. If you wanted to go to an elite university, if you wanted to go to Princeton or Harvard, every position there was earmarked for you. You didn't have to compete with Jews, with African Americans, with Latinos, with women. So the world was at your feet. And the world was structured so heavily around, white men being at the top of that hierarchy that they weren't even aware that they had this enormous privilege. It's just the way things were. So fast forward to 2022, if you're a white kid and you want to go to Harvard, right? Or if you want to go to Berkeley, like I'm in the UC system, chances are you probably won't get in. because now you're competing with women who have higher high school GPAs, who have higher test scores. You're competing with non-whites who have a whole series of interesting talents that they're bringing. You have to compete, and so suddenly you're not guaranteed those positions. Suddenly you're not guaranteed the union job that will support your family in a middle-class life. And you're oftentimes you're sitting, for example, in the middle of the country, and you're watching immigrants from China and India, for example, move to Silicon Valley and suddenly live the dream that you will not be able to live. And I think it is a shock and it is a change. And all they know is that their country is changing. It's changing in a way that they don't like, that they're not comfortable with, that they can't compete in. And so they do feel that they have lost something. And if you look at the numbers, if you look at how whites are doing, and this is actually really interesting, and it gives you a sense of their perspective. Whites are doing in terms of marriage rates, suicide rates, divorce rates, educational levels, income. It has declined more than any other group. African Americans and Latinos at worst have remained stable. Whites have declined more. And they perceive this. Now, what you don't hear is that they started at a much higher level. And even after having declined, they are still at a higher level. But all they see and feel is this loss. And I think that just eats at them, and they feel it is undeserved and unjustified, and they're angry and resentful.
I think it's really important that people understand that relative deprivation is truly very powerful. I see it. I have white friends who complain to me about how hard it is for them now. I kid you not. And I grew up in a predominantly white area outside of Chicago. So I know this. Now, hurt feelings are hurt feelings. You talk in your book about, and I love this phrase, it's the first time I've ever heard it before, ethnic entrepreneur. So you have hurt feelings, but can you talk a little bit about the kind of leadership that takes advantage of these hurt feelings?
Yeah. So, so there are ambitious, every single population around the world has ambitious people who want money and power generally. And they're looking for any strategy that will catapult them into to be president of Yugoslavia, for example, or anything that will catapult them to getting the #1 ratings on television. So there are these people, and one of the strategies that works, and we'd have to have a psychologist actually with us right now to explain why this strategy works, but it works, is to play on people's fears and threats and anger, sort of their deepest emotions, at sort of the oldest reptilian part of our brain, the fight or flight response. And they have figured out that if they play to a sense of threat, that a person, their family, their group is under threat, one, they will pay much more closer attention to what you are saying. And they will tend to want to align with you, thinking that you're going to protect them from this threat. And so what ethnic entrepreneurs are, they generally historically tend to be politicians. And sort of the classic example of an ethnic entrepreneur is Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia, who initiated the war in the former Yugoslavia by playing on Serb fears that if they didn't fight the Croats first, if they didn't, fire the first shot, that the Croats were going to get power. And if the Croats got power, they were going to throw Serbs out of government, out of their jobs, and start killing them again like they did during World War II. So Milosevic was the classic ethnic entrepreneur. But what these politicians do is they create a threat. And then through propaganda, and it used to be through radio and television and newspapers, and sometimes dropping leaflets from airplanes, and now it's all done via social media. They just continuously put out this message that there's a group out there, and oftentimes they're immigrants, oftentimes they're the other, they don't look like you, they're trying to take over your country, and if you don't go after them first, they're going to slaughter you. And it's very, very effective. So they're politicians, but you also see historically, people in media doing this who are doing it for ratings. You see it actually in churches and religious organizations, because it's really effective in bringing people into a congregation. So ethnic entrepreneurs are individuals who, for self-interested reasons, play on ethnic fears to get and maintain themselves in power.
So I'm sure you've been following the January 6th committee's hearing very closely. Are you hearing and seeing in the tape testimony what it is you think they need to be? Because it's been powerful, and a lot of it's actually been new, which is sort of shocking at this point. Are they doing what they need to do? And if they're not, what would you like to see happening that's really going to have an impact on shifting the overall narrative and getting us maybe a little on track?
Yeah. I think they're doing a fabulous job presenting the evidence to the public. Really tremendous. The fact that they started with Republicans, made it very, very hard to claim that this was a witch hunt by the left. So I think they're doing all the right things, and I still think it's not going to have a big effect. And it's not going to have a big effect because we live in a heavily divided information environment. Mm-hmm. If you're a business leader and you're getting your news from the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, it doesn't matter what's being presented by the January 6th committee. That information is not getting to you. If you are a majority of Republicans who are getting your news via social media or via local news or via Fox, you're not going to get that information. It's not going to get on your screens, and instead the information that you're going to be fed is going to be just information that confirms what you already believe, which is that the last election was stolen, Joe Biden is illegitimate, that the left is trying to steal your country. And that's what we're seeing. So I don't really see this moving the needle, certainly not with the right. The left, you're already preaching to the converted, and maybe there's some movement in the middle, and maybe that will matter. And that, I think, is exactly what the strategy is. And I hope they're successful. But I think, we have a really big information problem here in this country. Every country around the world has a big information problem. But the fact that our social media is completely unregulated, unlike, for example, Western Europe, makes it an even more difficult problem for us.
That being said, I'm watching the January 6th hearings. My mom's watching the January 6th hearings. And you mentioned in your book that conversation groups, civic engagement is part of a potential solution. So do you think there's a way that we could get people to coalesce around maybe just discussing? They could watch it on C-SPAN, ways that people can actually discuss it and use social media for good? Maybe?
Yeah, I think what's happening at the grassroots level is really phenomenal. And if there's an area that gives me hope, it's what's happening at the grassroots level. And if I do think about, what can we do, where will reform come from? I'm much more hopeful it's going to come from the bottom up than the top down. These groups like Eric Liu and Janae Kane, I talk about them in the book. They have an organization called Citizen University. They do a lot of things, but one of the things that they're determined to do is to teach Americans how to actually be a good citizen. That's what civics classes used to do, but most students don't have civics classes anymore. And if you don't have civics classes, you don't actually know how power is divided in this country. You don't even know how our government works. If you don't know how the government works and you don't know what power you as an individual citizen has, that means you can't wield that power. And if you don't know what your power is, then somebody else who understands the system is going to take it from you. So I am more hopeful that these grassroots organizations will teach people about the system, teach them about the power of peaceful protest, which is underestimated. There's a woman at the Kennedy School at Harvard who's done amazing work on civil resistance. Her name's Erica Chenoweth. If you haven't met her, bring her on board. She's just a phenom. And she's done all of this research to show that peaceful protest is actually incredibly effective at causing politicians to make changes that they otherwise wouldn't make. And again, like, if Americans don't know this, if they don't know, even how to organize, then they're going to stay at home and they're not going to participate. And again, our democracy will eventually be taken away from us. So I really do. I'm a huge advocate of getting people out of their houses onto the streets, peacefully protesting, making their demands known, going out to the polls. Another thing I talk about in the book is that people think states like Kentucky and West Virginia are these deep red states, and they will never be anything but very conservative states. And I have a quote there by a woman, I think she was from Kentucky, who said, we don't know actually if Kentucky is red or blue. All we know is Kentucky is non-voting. Only 22% of registered voters in Kentucky, it's either Kentucky or West Virginia, only 22% of eligible voters vote. That means that almost 80% of eligible voters don't participate. And so you can imagine a situation where if a much higher percent of people actually went to the polls, took responsibility for our democracy, that we would get different outcomes. The makeup of the House of Representatives, the makeup of the Senate would look differently. And then we could actually institute reform from the top down. So I really believe in the power of the people, but they have to understand their power.
That's such a wonderful place for us to end our conversation for now.
Yes. I was like,
and understanding our power. And we're going to have you back and talk about whether or not, the work that you do, that the Lincoln Project does, that so many organizations are doing right now, is able to move the needle and get people to embrace the power they have. So thank you so much, Barbara, for being with us today.
Yeah, and thank you both for the work you're doing, for getting this message out. Thank you to your listeners who care enough to spend the time with you. I can't think of anything more important in my lifetime than what we are doing right now. And we're really just at the beginning of it. So we have a lot of work ahead of us.
And I'm glad that we're all on board together doing it, truly. That way we don't have to pack our go bags. Though
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. I won't pack the bags just yet. I'm going to stay because I thought that was such an interesting point about power and people needing to understand how power works. That's a great reason to learn about power. If I hear that, like as an individual, and I go, oh, gosh, somebody's going to take advantage of me if I don't learn about the system, then that's the incentive to learn about the system. So I'd love to see what Citizen University is doing. Maybe we can have somebody from there come talk to us, because this is the stuff that gives me hope, truly. And there is so much at stake. And, this show, the Lincoln Project, everything that we do, we can't do it without you. So just a reminder, you can make a donation to the Lincoln Project in order to, there it is, the QR code. Any amount is helpful because we love doing these shows. And you can also go, look, thank you, Sam, for the banner.
Yeah, it is. It is so important. And it's another way that, from the bottom up, we are all doing this work together. And it's so important. And we have so much gratitude for all of you and everything that you're doing out there. Another time that you can check in with us is Thursday, of course, the breakdown with Tara Setmayer and Rick Wilson. They will be on at 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific tomorrow to discuss the 5th, January 6th hearing. And before we go, we want to have you take a look at the latest ad that the Lincoln Project dropped today called They Knew, and we will see you all next week. Night, everybody.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
He lost and he knew it. Everyone around him lied to you, but told him the truth.
He delivered to the president pretty blunt terms. He was going to lose.
I did not see evidence of fraud.
I respect Attorney General Barr, so I accepted what he was saying.
And, unfortunately, our guys walked into the trap.
Why? To rip off his own voters, to steal $250 million from the suckers on his email list. And it worked.
Look into this so we get to the bottom of it. Let's have trial by combat.
The biggest con game in political history. And MAGA voters were the suckers who bought it. It says a lot about them and everything about him.
We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.